Okay, we are recording. So hello to everybody listening. Today is April 18th. It's a Tuesday, and I am here with Jon Uhler. Jon is a licensed professional counselor, LPC. He is also make sure I get these credentials right, a certified sex offender treatment provider, as well as a certified clinical trauma professional. And so he's worked for over a decade, well, multiple decades, but over a decade, like 14, 15 years in a prison in the Department of Corrections.
11 years in a prison. And then the rest has been, as far as with sex offenders, up to about 14 years now working with sex offenders.
Okay.
I currently have 3 groups, about 45 guys. I may have to start my 4th.
Okay. So a lot of experience working with both offenders and also survivors and victims of abuse. And I reached out to Jon because I've been following him for a few months now, and I am very passionate about protecting women's and children's spaces and our rights. And I feel like I'm pretty knowledgeable about a lot of issues in this, what we might call the trans movement, trans rights, whatever we want to call it. But I started coming across Jon's stuff and his content, and a lot of it kind of blew me away and was new information to me, but I believed it. I thought, wow, this is really interesting, new things that I'd never thought about. So I reached out to him and asked if he would like to have a conversation and talk about a few things. So here we are. Thank you for coming on, Jon.
You're more than welcome. It's my pleasure.
And did I get everything right as far as your background?
You did. And the only thing I would add is I currently do therapy by day and then sex offender treatment by night.
Wow.
Along with the different websites that I have. For our conversation, what I would throw out there is we have a new resource for people, kind of burning the candle at both ends to get it up and running. But it's so needed, and therefore I felt compelled. So I believe that the trans movement needs to be unmasked, and therefore it's unmaskingthetransmovement.com.
Right. And I know you also do survivor support, Church Protect, and like a SOGI task force. Is that correct?
A SOGI International Task Force. And then I have actual podcast that deals with counseling topics on Friday night.
Awesome. So I do want to talk about all of that stuff too. So let's start. I did want to ask you a question just about your professional background working with sex offenders. Is that something that you sought out, or was it just a job that, you saw a job opening and you took it and then, developed an expertise there?
It came looking for me. I actually turned the guy down. He was the former chief psychologist of SCI Crest in a prison. And I, at that time, was running a adolescent female, a 12-bed adolescent female, so teen girls group home, an intensive treatment program. What took me out from California to Pennsylvania, to Cambria County, which is one of the mid-sized counties out there, about 2 hours out east of Pittsburgh, was one of the counties, Cambria County, needed to revamp their child welfare system, and I'm very familiar with that. And so I became director of Children and Family Services, or Children and Youth Services, as they call it there. So I was the acting director for a year. And then after that, opened up my own group home. But then the Department of Corrections came knocking in a legitimate way. I turned them down. I turned him down a couple of different times. Now I know what was really going on, but he made a pitch because he knew of my background, and he knew that I was game for doing novel things, and the state system. So whenever a state system looks outside itself to hire somebody, you kind of have to question what's going on.
Right.
But they were mandated to start, and none of the psych staff wanted to do this. So a lot of them going to sort of go on strike. But they were tasked with starting what would be the nation's first intensive treatment program in long-term solitary confinement for the likes of the Hannibal Lecters and others. So nobody wanted to touch that. So they had to find somebody outside. 3 institutions regionally were tasked with that. None of them were accomplishing it. So they had to find a sucker. I mean, they had to find somebody that knew. So I finally said yes under the guise that, said I had unlimited authority, unlimited budget. None of that was true. But that's how I ended up in the prison system. I turned them down a couple different times. And then they finally made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So here I am, an outsider, having worked with kids in the system, but having worked with survivors, walking into where few outsiders go. But that would be my place of work for 6 solid years. I mean, I would do things in the general institution, but through that, I accrued more clinical contact hours in that environment than any single prison psychology staff member in the US or Canada. So if you've ever seen the movie Silence of the Lambs and Clarice, and she's spending time in pane and glass between them, she spent, for the duration of that movie, she spent about as much time with Hannibal Lecter as I did with my guys in 1 week. Right. And so from that, I then also headed up one of the standalone high intensity forensic units, 65-bed program for sexually violent predators, then did a high and low intensity sex offender treatment, worked with different kinds of groups, also headed up the mental health unit. So after 11 years, I decided it was time to retire, but did hundreds of parole evaluations, specialized parole evaluations for sex offenders and risk assessments. So that's, and then working with them now still.
Okay. Yeah. And I asked because I mentioned to you, my background is in music therapy, and I've worked in psychiatric hospitals, and I've been around sex offenders, but not in the same capacity. It's I'll go and do a group on the unit, and there happens to be a sex offender, and sometimes he comes to my group and sometimes he doesn't. And I will say this, I hated being around them. I hated it. I knew it was my job to I have to do my group. I can't turn anybody, unless they're acting inappropriate, but I can't turn people away from my groups. And I just did not like being around them. But I thought to myself, these guys need treatment. They need somebody to sit down and work with them, but it can't be me. So I think what you've done is really brave and unique and admirable, to go into the pit and just face these guys. And I can only imagine what it's like to do that kind of work. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about safeguarding. And I think you and I are both agree that women, or at least vulnerable women and children, need to be protected. And I think we all understand why children need to be protected, but I'm curious why do you think all women or just vulnerable women, why do women in general need protection or need special places away from men?
Because in the heart of a guy, if he's not transformed or if he's not civilized, lies a barbarian. World history shows that.
Yes. And that kind of brings me to something else I've heard a lot when talking about this issue is people will say, oh, well, women pose just as much a risk to each other as men do, or women can hurt children. And yeah, that's true, but not in the same capacity. So I wonder if you have any insight or knowledge on that, the difference between deviant women and deviant men.
My response is simply this to those that will say that. Tell me how many years you've worked in prison.
Most of them will say 0.
Right? Simple as that. A lot of things, a lot of these discussions stem from people that haven't got clue one. They aren't therapists. They haven't worked in intensive environments. They've never worked behind bars. So they're running their mouths about things they don't know, or they actually do know and they want to obfuscate. The reality is this: unless you understand the mind of a predator, you don't know. I know, because I've worked hard to figure it out. And the guys in my group know. I would tell them, so I say this tongue in cheek, but I'm also somewhat serious. I would tell the guys that my goal was to be the world's best psychopath. And then I would say this: you don't know if I'm kidding. but I'm deadly serious because I have to be better at this than they are. So I understand the mind of a psychopath, though I'm not published yet. Got Robert Hare. He's the one that designed the PCLR. I probably made you uncomfortable. let me qualify this, okay? The question is, what would we call a guy that had designs or intentions to cross the sexual boundaries of a woman or a child? You would call him a predator.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You would call the police for, okay. You would call him a predator. Do most people know what predators are like? Well, after they get arrested and we see them behind bars, but prior to being arrested, where are they? They're all around. Okay. I know the characteristics of a predator. Yeah, what I ask people is this: if with my history, and people debate me all the time, but again, I just simply ask this: tell me how many clinical contact hours you've spent behind bars in solitary confinement with guys that become men and women and children's worst nightmares. And it's inevitably zero. Even the academic experts, the average academic, do you know how much time they've spent behind bars with these guys? Well, they got their undergrad.
Hours here and there, yeah.
Right? They got their undergrad, and then they got their grad, and then they went on for their PhD. Yet they'll teach criminology. Yet you ask, well, how many? Where did you access the subjects for your studies? Well, we interviewed them in prison. Okay, so you had a room, and you had about 3 hours with each inmate, where you either had a speaker system going on, recording everything, or officers in the room, and you interviewed which population? Sex offenders, the world's most deceptive liars. And you took what at face value? So now you'll say that, well, sex offenders, really child predators, are reenacting their own abuse at the age that they were perpetrated upon. That's how they selected.
That's something that I've heard and something that I've read in psychology.
And it's not true.
Yeah. So I remember you saying that and I was like, what?
It's not true. Right? But how did we learn that? Well, of course, and it's an urban legend. It's an urban myth. I would recommend people go on to churchprotect.org. I have myths and truths, churchprotect.org. And those are some of the things that I learned. And so the trans movement, really people need to understand this. And I guess 30 years in the field now, I've got a little perspective. What I tell people is this, is the best way to understand the trans movement is that it doesn't exist. Now, of course, that's the reason we're talking about it. Of course it exists. But I then try to help people understand that it's the greatest psychological man-made scam, scheme, and ruse ever devised. It's been so effective with brilliant marketing that now we'll use the term trans. So it's real. And so we'll say there are trans kids. You know, there aren't trans kids. And people say, get that guy out of the field. He says, no, there's no trans people. Oh, what are there? There are people. There are boys and girls, men and women, some of whom are gender confused. But you can't change XXXY chromosome. So it's a state of mind. And now, unfortunately, with cult-like effectiveness, it's been the ultimate form of brainwashing. So if anybody in your audience uses the term, I don't have a problem with the term, but I just want people to know, if you use the term trans, you've been mentally and emotionally manipulated. Okay, it's a marketing thing, right? And Jennifer Billig, Jennifer Billig of the 11th Hour blog, she and I couldn't be any more separate in terms of our politics per se, but I don't get into politics specifically because I want to focus on this. But she and I agree 100% that this is she gets more into, she follows the money. She's brilliant investigator.
I'm a little familiar with her work.
Right. Yeah. So I recommend people do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I don't sometimes I'll say trans when I'm referring to like the movement, but I don't, there's no such thing as a trans person. There are people who, for a million different reasons, whatever, call themselves. Well, and okay, and here's another question. Like, do you think gender dysphoria is real? Like, do you think that there are people who, because I'm starting to think it's all just a fetish now, or it's all just like or are there people who are just, there's this real dysphoria inside them?
Prior to the question is, what happened prior to the year 2013 when the DSM-5 came out? And you can trace this entire movement, by the way. If you want to make the movement go away, remove the porn, its influence in those using it to groom kids, and you go back to the diagnosis that was, everything was fine with the DSM-4, and the entire movement will dry up and blow away. It'll fade back to the numbers that we saw in 2005, which was 0. That's how I answer that question. Now, somebody came up with the diagnostic term, gender dysphoria. Do I think it's real? The diagnosis is there. Do I think it's real? No.
Yeah.
If somebody focuses on gender dysphoria as a therapist, I believe they're inept.
Yeah.
Because it's a symptom of something. Somebody is hung up on how they look and how they feel. And the real question, the follow-up question should be, how long have you been feeling this way? Meaning, how did this become an issue in your life? Because what that has done is it's prevented them from growing as a person. And we need to help young people begin to get actual self-esteem. There was a time in the field of psychology that was the goal. And so you helped somebody come to understand themselves and play upon their strengths and develop competencies. That's how somebody develops self-esteem. So you wanted to come to embrace your uniqueness. Well, now the trans movement has come along and taken psychology and psychiatry and mental health, human services by storm. And so now we tell kids that if you don't like yourself, you need to eradicate yourself, including bury your dead name. And it has dumbed it down and made mandated reporters, by the way. So this is the issue of safety now, to kind of come full circle back to your question. My concern for the trans movement, or about the trans movement, is this. It is a financial and sexual predator's greatest gift. Because it makes vulnerable a group of people, a population, and it really is populations within a population, that have a difficult time with boundaries, a difficult time with their intuition. And that's all a predator needs. Financial predators see you as a dollar sign. Where do we find financial predators? Go car shopping and you'll find them. They'll find you. You step out of your car and they're coming smiling at you. Right? Now, that's not a pejorative thing against everybody that sells cars, right? But we all know about, right? We know you go onto a car lot and guess what? You have these salespeople that come smiling at you, but why do we get all anxious before driving onto a car lot? Because we know the smiling salespeople are going to come at us. Well, why do we get upset at that? They're smiling. They haven't insulted us because we know what they're going to try. They're going to try to upsell us. Okay, so that's a financial predator. But with that, if they can bring us along, we'll actually give them a 5-star rating and a nice review, and we'll tell people about we had such a wonderful sales experience. But meanwhile, they took us to the cleaners. Okay. It's the same thing with a sexual predator.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you said, I just had the thought, I think most women, we have that experience where there's a man who he hasn't said or done anything. It's like the salesman, like he's just smiled at us, but it's some kind of intuition or feeling we have where we're just like, and it's hard to describe because I don't want to say like, oh, don't smile and talk to women, guys.
No, that's right. But Rachel, think about what the trans and the narrative, the pushers. Now think about the pushers. And that's really, we're going to need to differentiate between those that are being victimized by this. That's about 80%. Versus those that are the cult leaders, those that are the pushers and the activists. Those are part of the special interest. They have something to gain feeding off the 80%. And those are the ones that are they're very adept at, and they're the ones that push this, and they're the ones that are working the politicians. They craft all the talking points. Trans rights or human rights. Who comes up with that? They come up with the slogans, and they have the mindless ones repeat them. And that's when you see these young people that become reactive. They can't think. They don't know what the issue is. They will fall back to talking points. Well, that's what a cult does.
Yes.
And so what the cult leaders do is they target people that have a hard time with their intuition, and they will cause you to question and then be apologetic for eventually having intuition, which allows you, which is the only thing that causes you to be concerned, to be to question what is so, as far as the intentions, the thoughts, the intentions of someone, which enables you to have boundaries. So if I can get you to apologize for being suspicious, that's different than being jaded. If I can get you to apologize for having installed locks on your door, you're actually going to remove the locks.
Yeah.
And guess what home I'm going to target?
My home, yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Amy Souza of Known Heretic, but she does a really good job about talking about these instincts and how so much of this movement is having us deny our senses, deny what we see, and deny what we hear. And that's what predators do.
Sure.
And she talked about Little Red Riding Hood, like, oh, grandma, what big teeth you have, what big eyes. And it's like this little girl is seeing something that's looks wrong, but the man in disguise is like, oh, it's okay. So she's an interesting person. If you haven't looked at her work yet.
Yeah, I have. She does a wonderful job. I just posted something about, from her. No, she does a wonderful job.
She's great. So again, back to just the differences between men and women. I guess it's a pretty easy thing to bust, or a myth to bust. And would you say, I've seen the statistic before, I think it's universal, but in prisons, there are more incarcerated male sex offenders than the entire female population. I know that's true for a couple states, and I think in the UK. Does that sound right? I don't know if you know
that may be a little bit high, but at the same time, it doesn't negate what you're saying. Right now, I think in Pennsylvania, there's 25 prisons, or maybe 23. But there were, when I retired, there were 27. Okay. So we'll say there's 25 right now, but I could Google it. So 23 prisons, I'm sorry, say 25. The one thing that hasn't changed is there are only 2, SEM Muncie and Cambridge Springs, okay, in the state of Pennsylvania. Okay, so 25 total. That means we've got 23 male prisons and 2 female. Let it sink in.
Yeah. And
we'll just start with that. Start with that. Who commits more crimes? Well, you build prisons based upon the need. Okay, now, within that, how many sex offenders do we find? Within the overall prison population, I think about 10% are sex offenders for males. I have the stats back when I was leaving. Men commit the full range of offenses, number one. Okay, in a male prison, so we'll just start with the general. What are you going to find in a male prison? You're going to find every offense under the sun represented in there. What are you going to find in a female prison? You're not going to find every offense. You're going to tend to find one of 2 categories. Those that committed offenses while they were under the influence of men. Okay, so it was dealing with drugs. How did they get into? Okay, maybe 3 categories. One, the categories, they were numbing themselves out. So drugs and alcohol. Two is they were being manipulated by men, but oftentimes they're going to be manipulated by men. They were driving the car when he was going to do the drug deal. So she gets busted. So inevitably, you're going to find in that category, it's probably like 90, 10, 80, 20. Women that have been abused within a prison setting, almost all the women in prison have been abused, number one. But I would say the majority have done passive kinds of crimes. Okay. Or you have those women that did really heinous things. It's kind of interesting. Maybe they're mad as hell and they couldn't take it anymore, but they're the really brutal ones. It's very interesting. So you don't have a lot of middle ground as far as female offenses. So you have the mild things, and those are the ones that really need treatment, quite frankly. And that's what's so sad about a female prison. There's no treatment being given, and they need help because a lot of them are mothers. Yeah. And it's abhorrent what happens to females in prison. And now these deviant men have made it, along with deviant male lawmakers, where they're putting men, and I will describe, and I have publicly said, and I'll say it again right now, if you want to debate me, if anybody wants to debate me, then at your expense, you pay for me to do a deep dive analysis into the records, the prison records of the men that are wanting access into prisons, into women's prisons. And if you're part of a state or provincial or federal system, and I will show you that 100% of those men have perpetrated sexual offenses against women. About half are on paper sex offenders. But I have right now, within my group of 45 guys, I have 3 that on paper, they have no sex offense. Why are they in my group? Because they do plea deals and they horse trade these things away. So that on paper, they could actually say to someone that's unsuspecting, well, I have no sex offense. Right? So you look up on, do a background, and on paper, it looks like they don't have a sex offense. But meanwhile, they're sitting in my sex offender treatment group. Yeah. So 100% of the men, the deviant men, the sexually deviant men that want access into female prisons are dangerous and will end up assaulting the women in one way or another. Because here I just talked about trans. I don't use the term, but I'll use it loosely now. 100% of the quote unquote legitimate trans inmates, again, don't want to go to a female prison. Why? Especially in this day and age, they are treated as a privileged class in the male population. And how did they end up in prison? I'll tell you exactly how. Their lifestyle, 100% of the time. What were the majority of them doing? The vast majority of them, all of them were into drugs. So it shows you it's not a healthy lifestyle, but the vast majority were into prostitution. So if you have a guy that's into prostitution that dresses up like a woman, which prison population do you think he wants to stay in? With a bunch of men or a bunch of women? With a bunch of men. Okay, because that's what he likes. Now, you can't have sex in a prison. It's not only is it against the rules, it's against the law now. You have what's called PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act. So no sex in prison per policy of any prison is considered consensual. And this is true even if you're working with adolescents. The reason why there's so many rules in an environment where people can harm one another, where big people, manipulative people can harm somebody else, is you have vulnerable people in institutions or residential treatment. So even for adolescents, you tell the kids there is no physical contact, meaning it's not permitted. You lay those rules out there. Why? Because the vast majority of it is going to be non-consensual in the sense that if you have somebody that's strong-arming somebody else, is the victim ever going to agree that they were strong-armed? No, because they know if the perp gets in trouble, and the perp's still in the same facility, or the perp has, let's say, gang related, that the person that calls for help, they're going to get assaulted again. So that's the whole thing. The administration will pull in a guy that was either raped or beat up and say, it looks like somebody assaulted you. No, I just fell down the stairs. Why isn't he bringing it up? For fear of additional retaliation. And therefore, it is reality that there is no consensual sex in prison per policy and dynamics. Yet, what do you hear in the news? What's this narrative? No, if they have sex, it's consensual. That is a lie, and it's playing upon people's ignorance that don't understand the prison system or secure environments. So there is no such thing as consensual sex in prison. It's against policy. And if something does happen, a police report is filed. It's considered rape.
Hey, sorry to be quiet.
It's okay. So people need to understand that, because that will put to end. So the guys that are wanting in there and the guys that get in there, okay, the guys that want in there are dangerous. Once they're in, we've heard, this inmate, this trans inmate impregnated. So it means a guy. Now, they had consensual sex. No, by nature, there's no consensual sex. So it shows you the media is pushing this false narrative. All these guys are going to rape women because they're putting them in a cell and shutting the door with other women.
And it's
so horrific.
It's sickening, and it just makes me so angry at some people, because I hear these people that, back to my question again, they'll say like, well, women rape each other. I'm like, no, we don't. Like, no,
they don't. As a matter of fact, ready? As a matter of fact, I'll challenge anybody right now, and you can come on my live program at any point in time. Find one news story, and the sex assaults that are perpetrated by women are different by nature. Because I'll break them out for the females. For the guys, it's going to run the gamut. But rare is the time that you, as a matter of fact, deviance by nature. As a matter of fact, those that are going to push this narrative, I ask them, tell me what deviance means. Really, if somebody wants to run their mouth and try to minimize the dangers of men, first thing is this: tell me how many sex offenders you've worked with, in what setting, under what conditions, how many hours, and tell me what deviance means. And they won't. They're going to run their mouths in a situation where women are being harmed. Okay. The reality, right? The reality is this: I've never once come across a situation where in a sex offense, a woman has used an object on another woman or a child. But how many men? Hundreds, thousands.
It's hard.
By nature, it's different.
And psych hospitals aren't exactly the same as prison, but they're far from it.
It's close. It's close.
There's a lot of teams. And I worked in, I did my internship in a state hospital. So there are people there that were mentally incompetent to stand trial, or they weren't appropriate for prison because of mental illness or whatever. So they're sent to the state hospital. Although
a lot of prisons, a lot of prisons now have become quasi-state hospitals.
And
the reality.
And on a lot of hospitals, there'll be a male unit, a female unit, a mixed unit, whatever, different units. And sometimes it's just a matter of what beds are available. But if there was a guy, like a sex offender, or a guy who had like sexually inappropriate behavior, was creepy or whatever, he had to be on the men's unit. Like, he could not be on the mixed unit around female patients. But I've heard now, and I'm not working in those settings right now, but I'm just hearing from some friends that are still there. Like, there's guys coming in and like, I want on the female unit. I'm a woman.
Yeah.
And it's happened a few times, and they'll get naked on the unit. They'll expose themselves. And again, like, I'll bring it up to people, and they're like, well, it would be inappropriate for a woman to walk around naked in the women's unit. And sorry to be quiet. I don't know if you heard what I just said, but like, people will say like, oh, well, it would be inappropriate for a woman to walk around naked on the women's unit. And I'm like, it's not the same as a man being naked. Like, it's, I've seen women wandering around naked before on the women's unit. And we're like, oh, okay, go get dressed. Like, she's usually a little confused or whatever. But like, a man who's intentionally getting naked in front of women like that, like, he's a predator. He's a creep. Like, And it's so frustrating. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because you know these guys, you know what's going on in their heads.
Rachel, what I would also say is this. To those that seem driven, and really that's what you and I online encounter, and different people now that are pushing all this, because we can talk in circles and they'll come up with all these. First of all, again, I know they've never worked with the populations they're defending, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But I simply, at some point in time, usually sooner rather than later, I ascertain their background. They have no clinical background, number one. And they have no forensic background, and they have not worked with sex offenders. It just becomes clear. So they're running their mouths. Mm-hmm. Then it comes to reality that what they're suggesting happens to have to do with policies that are going to influence people, that are going to allow the people, the perpetrators, the men, that these apologists that have never worked with these kind of men, that are advocating that these kind of men go into women's private spaces. So number one, they're running their mouths about populations they have no clue about. Mm-hmm. Okay, I have over 14,000 clinical contact hours. Yeah. And these people that want to run their mouths suggesting these men are fine and need to be coddled and catered to and put in women's private spaces. Mr. or Mrs. Apologist, tell me how many clinical contact hours you've had working with sexual predators. Mm-hmm. They don't. Okay, so number one, we've established they're running their mouths out of ignorance. Now, the real world question, twofold. One is safety, but the primary question is this that I have for that entire group of apologists is this. Since when did you become Mr. and Mrs. Let's open the doors for these sensitive men? Since when did you become so unconcerned for the safety of women and children to take such a low bar approach? Mm-hmm. Why are you so driven to lower the bar? Well, why are you placing their health, safety, and welfare at risk? For who? Mm-hmm. For guys that dress in women's underwear and drag? Mm-hmm. How does a guy begin dressing in women's underwear in the year 2023? I'll tell you exactly how, and you won't find an exception. Only guys that have saturated their minds in porn. Mm-hmm.
And can I ask you about that? I'm sorry to anybody who's might be listening to this because it's graphic, but can you describe the porn? Because we're not talking about your grandpa's Playboy or whatever.
No, and I still probably don't even know the half of it.
Yeah, okay. And I'm not saying that there's good porn that's okay.
Right? No.
Porn is good, but there's definitely some that's pretty heinous. And,
right. I recommend. We did an interview with the episode on unmasking the trans movement is Caitlin. She did a movie that turned out to be a porn movie. She wasn't told it was going to be that. Mm-hmm. But also Alex Aaron did a video. So there's a couple of interviews. Alex Aaron goes into pretty good detail about MindGeek, the company that owns Pornhub. Mm-hmm. Okay, she has described some of the stuff. I only stay on the internet on Google search. The same thing any kid can. Now, I read the police reports of the stuff and talk to the police officers of what is found on these, the electronics of these guys. As a matter of fact, this is on the film Shattered. I was featured in that. It was to help lawmakers in Minnesota become incentivized to make penalties harder or increase penalties against sex offenders. And one of the police officers featured on there is talking about the kind of material he used during his investigation. Mm-hmm. And he said the time that he finally had to step away from it, he couldn't do it anymore, was when he saw a film of somebody shoving a broom handle up inside a little infant, female infant, and they lifted her up on that. Okay, that's what we're talking about. The male mind does this when it becomes deviant. Mm-hmm. There's a stair-step process downward. I've worked with men that have chopped up female bodies. Mm-hmm. People need to understand that the male mind, once it goes dark, that by the time a guy is into child porn, he's one step away from it. He already has been accessing snuff porn. Okay. What you're seeing under WPATH and what you're seeing in the trans movement is a push now. You're going to start seeing more and more the term eunuch. Okay. What is a eunuch? Somebody that's been castrated. They're going to advocate this for kids. Why? Because sexual perpetrators, as they get to darker and darker deviant stuff, will mutilate children, and they get off on that. This is the degree that we're talking about. It is not your grandfather's porn, but people need to understand that Ted Bundy himself, he gave one interview, and that was to James Dobson. Ted Bundy reached out through his attorney to James Dobson. A lot of news outlets wanted access to James Bundy, but I'm sorry, to Ted Bundy, James, right? A lot of outlets wanted to interview Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair in Florida back in the 70s, I believe. But I think in the late 70s. But James Dobson was the one that Ted Bundy wanted to interview. No, I'm sorry, it was probably in the 80s then. I forget when Bundy was executed. But Bundy had heard Dobson talk about the dangers, the addictive nature of pornography, and Ted Bundy wanted the world to know. And he started, though he accepted responsibility. He was going to be executed. He wanted people to know that he became addicted by finding a magazine. Now, does that mean that every single person that looks at a magazine or looks at porn online is going to end up? No, but I'll tell you what, 100% of guys will be different and guys will progress. I've never once worked with a guy, I've worked with thousands, who did things to women that started, by the time they were busted, were at the same level of deviance of pornography, what they were looking at. It didn't start out the same, meaning it progressed, 100% of them. And now it's minimized. We call it kink. Kink is nothing more than a sexual predator's dream come true, because that means the women are being already dumbed down to believe that this somehow is sex when it's sexual assault.
Yeah. Oh, I'd need like a breath after that. I appreciate you sharing it because, like you said, a lot of people, and again, I don't think that there's any good porn, but, a lot of people, both men and women, have looked at porn at some point or regularly or whatever. But something interesting that I've heard you say before is that most people, most guys or whoever, they'll have a line that they won't cross, but becoming deviant it's not just somebody who's can't control themselves or whatever. It's a choice that they're making to violate their conscience and cross a boundary, cross a line of their conscience.
Right. And it's the equivalent of, it's really synonymous with becoming psychopathic. People need to understand there's two kinds of psychopaths, the kind that we all think of, bloody psychopath, but there's what's called a white-collar psychopath. Dr. Robert Hare of the PCLR, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, coined that phrase. People can do a simple Google search now in images. Type in the term brain scans of psychopaths and then go under the images and you'll see them. So a psychopath, there's no debate any longer as to whether or not a psychopath's brain, this is different than IQ points. This is different than white and gray matter. This is how it's processing information and what's going on in its mind. A psychopath is very different and will never come back. Very different than a normal person now. They become a predator. And the reason they'll never come back is this. They've lost the desire to ever be any other way than what they are and more of it. They want to double down on it. They want to be a better psychopath. And a psychopath doesn't consider himself a psychopath. He'll consider himself a sociopath at best. Okay. The easiest way to view it is really on a continuum. Once you get off the slippery slope, ego grows, and this is the best way to understand it. I work with all my sex offenders this way, and this is the only thing that makes sense to them, and they know that I know. Okay, so everybody needs to understand this is what nature, nurture, genetics, does that all play a part? Yeah, a little bit. Or you to have identical twins that are identical psychopaths. No, this is how it works. Okay, you violate your conscience long enough and you will. Therefore, two things will happen. You won't be sorry, there goes remorse, and you won't care, there goes empathy. So it comes down to conscience. Conscience will decrease in size or effectiveness to the extent that ego grows. And that's called the objectification process. So ideally, if I have a mind that is normal, I will value people. I will care about people. I will love people and use things. That's what we try to teach our kids, right? You love people and you use things. Black Friday is the opposite. They trample over people to get things. Okay, so those people, to the extent that they do that, they are psychopathic. They crash through the doors, they're trampling women and children, and they're not sorry. Now, they're not arrested, correct? But what kind of person do you have to be? You've just trampled a woman to death to go get your TV. You must be a joy to live with, right? Right? Once you get it home, ain't nobody sitting in your chair, and you're going to have your own man cave, and you're a Neanderthal, right? So, we've seen horror movies, so that's our picture of a psychopath. I'm convinced that most families have a psychopath in that family. James Fallon, he inadvertently scanned his brain, or he scanned his brain on purpose. It was part of an Alzheimer's study, but it got in the wrong pile. They also used their lab to scan for forensic purposes the brains of psychopaths. Well, he scanned his brain for the Alzheimer's study, and once he looked at it, it was a psychopath brain. So he's written books, and everybody's really fascinated to talk to him. But what I tell people is this: as you listen to him, there are two things that are true. Watch the audience; they lean in, because it's like, you're a psychopath. What's it like? But the questions they ask and his responses, everybody's met somebody like that. And when somebody asked him, when your family found out, did you tell your family? What did they say? Your wife and kids? And they said, well, they weren't surprised there. That everybody has in their family people that have become so comfortable in being selfish that it's all about them. And so we have to walk on eggshells around those people. These are the people that are the black holes. Now, will they ever do damage? The smarter they are, they won't do overt damage. But you can make people bleed in a bloodless way. You can slice and dice people, right? You can do a whole lot of damage to someone, make them hurt for the rest of their life, yet they can't pin it on you. Those kind of people go into finance and politics, by the way. Okay, right? So a psychopath, as someone begins to violate their conscience long enough, things change, and you layer that with, say, the key primary things are money, sex, and power, but you layer that with money. Now you're getting a financial psychopath. Where do you find those? On Wall Street. You find them in politics. You layer that with sex and sexuality, then a change happens. And people that don't understand this will assume, and first of all, predators know us better than we know them, because they once were not a predator, and they use that to their advantage. And all a predator needs to be able to be successful is two things: for us to believe he isn't one, and for us to give him the benefit of the doubt. Therefore, everything he does, you're going to reinterpret. And therefore, if he dresses in drag and he says he wants to come read to your kids in a library, you'll say, oh, isn't that sweet? Oh, he wants to go on a women's sports team. Oh, you know what? I think we need to allow that. Isn't it interesting? They also always want to access what? The locker rooms. So people can really understand why these guys do it. And I called it, even sadly, I was right, both with Sam Brinton and with Leah Thomas. These guys are just deviant men. Sam Brinton, by the way, stole the suitcase so he could get the women's underwear. That's why he never returned the underwear. He was masturbating in the women's underwear. Okay, 100% of the time. Okay, but he was given a slap on the wrist, did a plea deal. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, with Leah Thomas, I knew you do digging long enough, you're going to find out that this guy is deviant as the day is long. Pornography, by the way, in the male brain, it will create a deep malevolence toward women. And therefore, that's why men will put their hands on women's throats.
Mhm.
Women need to understand, if any guy puts their hand on a woman's throat, they're a threat.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter what 50 Shades of Grey reframe it. When that came out, I was doing sex offender treatment. It was Valentine's Day, Friday, when that movie came out. And I asked the guys, because they all had block TV, they could see commercials. I asked them what they thought about it. And they all said this. I mean, what a great field research study, huh? To hear about sex offenders behind bars. How do they feel about 50 Shades of Grey? Their response is this. It's made the grooming process easier for them. They love the film because now a woman can't discern between sexual assault versus BDSM and kink.
Mhm.
And a woman thinks that she knows the guy that she's interacting with in that capacity, but she doesn't know if he's going to take a knife and slice her up the middle, does she?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and it's funny with like 50 Shades of Grey. I think from a woman's perspective, it's like this fairy tale, like Beauty and the Beast and other stories. It's like, oh, I can change this man. I can.
And how well does it? It's fiction. That's right. It's fiction.
It's
That's
fiction,
right.
and it's like,
how well does it work? Other than that movie, you show me where it works. It's absolute fiction. That's right. As a matter of fact, I tell people this: a guy and a gal go to 50 Shades of Grey for a date.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening inside both of them? If we could tap in. For the woman, she's following the storyline.
Mm-hmm.
The guy doesn't even know there's a storyline.
Yeah.
Women need to understand that.
Yeah.
And the issue of deviance is this. It progresses for the men. It progresses through various stages. It starts with attraction, eye to eye. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how we meet one another. Though now with selfishness, it will move into lust. What is lust? It's now more about me than you. So now I am selfish. That's where people assume sex offenses happen. They don't. If ego continues to grow, if selfishness continues to grow, if conscience is violated, the snowball now is starting to move downhill and it's growing, is now going to get into power and control and objectifying. I mean, the whole process is happening at the same time. Then it's going to move into the defiling stage. Mm-hmm. That's where, as Alex Aaron has talked about, Latina abuse, meaning now I'm abusing someone. Mm-hmm. As a guy is morphing into that, as he's getting into that kind of, meaning he's accessing it, he's watching it, what's going on the inside of him? He's becoming a psychopath. Women need to understand that.
That's a porn site, if nobody knows, if you don't know what that is. It's a porn site where women are beat up and choked and spit on and called names and all sorts of horrible things.
Yeah. Okay. But I would say this, when a guy starts to get into kink or BDSM, it's the same by degree. He's morphing into a psychopath. Women need to understand this. What's happening is this, where a normal guy can only get an erection to the extent that he believes his partner is enjoying herself. That's why the highest paid prostitutes know how to fake it. Mm-hmm. That's a normal guy. I'm not suggesting that a normal guy uses a prostitute. I'm not suggesting that at all. Mm-hmm. But the idea of mood, like, oh, I'm not in the mood, or the mood went away, or just before he's ready to climax, she was all of a sudden say, oh, the ceiling's really dirty. I got to clean the ceiling. What's going to happen? Okay. He'll lose an erection. Why? Mm-hmm. Because there's an emotional ego need kind of component. Mm-hmm. Okay. That guy is still within the realm of normal kind of, there's hope for that kind of guy. Okay. Might be a selfish pig, but he's still within the realm of normal. Okay. That's a normal guy that he can only get an erection as long as he believes there's a mood and that she's enjoying herself. When a guy moves into deviance, He cannot get an erection when he knows that a woman is enjoying herself.
Mm-hmm.
He can only get an erection when he knows he's traumatizing her.
Mm-hmm.
He's no longer normal. He's a predator.
Yeah.
And so that's why they are driven to harm and scar and defile. And then after that, they'll go down lower. All the porn, it's like an hourglass. The adult porn will eventually, the women will eventually look younger and younger.
Mm-hmm.
And the children are dressed up, toddlers and tiaras, to look older. And it all converges about the age of 13. The inmates knew this term. I didn't. It's called Barely Legal. It turns out there's an actual magazine started by a woman. Okay. And so the sexual perpetrators that don't have children, all of them ended up going down to Barely Legal and somehow realizing what was happening. And so they increased the age. Mm-hmm. It's weird to say that, but that's what happens. Yeah. The ones that didn't, because they weren't shocked any longer and they wanted to go lower. Mm-hmm. And then their focus becomes kids. And that's why it is a misnomer to say, well, if a guy only has child victims, then he's safe to put in a female prison. He's not, because he'll harm women. He's looked at adult female porn first. So it's a lie. This minor attracted persons thing is a lie. Mm-hmm. And that's why you can't fake it. You can't fool inmates. Mm-hmm. If minor attracted persons if they were born that way, even among the inmates, there would be some degree of empathy. Even within the inmate population, it's interesting. Among the mental health unit, if you come across somebody that's truly mentally challenged in a prison setting, you can kind of see that. And there's a degree of the inmates will police themselves, that some of the more low functioning inmates are actually sometimes the safer, because the inmates even think it's too low to take advantage of somebody like that. It's very interesting. They'll police themselves. So if they have some sort of, if they have some sort of degree of empathy, meaning if an inmate were to beat up a low functioning inmate, the guy that beat him up would get beat up. Yeah. Right. But how come the pedophiles are targeted by everybody? Mm-hmm. Why don't the inmates have empathy for the pedophiles if they were born that way? Because all the inmates know they weren't born that way. So only the general public buys that lie.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And that's something that I've kind of, like I said, I've heard that before, and I've heard attraction to a minor or a child is different, or it's the same as being attracted to somebody else. Like they can't control it. They can't.
And it's not, it's developed.
But they can control how they act, that they can't change their attraction. And I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. But, now
I just described.
I don't believe
just described
anymore,
because what you're going to find is this. Once a guy is busted with child rape porn, okay, let that sink in. Yeah. Because I've never once found a guy that had child rape porn on his.
You froze.
Are we there? I can still hear you. Maybe we did freeze up here. Okay, there we go. Right, there we go. Okay, so this is important now for the issue of protecting women and children. Mm-hmm. Okay, people need to understand this, that in 14 years, I've never come across one guy that I'm working with. Because if he were to confess, walks in the police station saying, I'm so bothered by all this, here's all my electronics. And he'd be arrested and then charged, and he'd do time. I've never found that guy in 14 years. Okay. So people need to understand they don't confess. And I'll tell you the reason why they don't confess. Here it is. They're not sorry. No, they don't confess because they're afraid of, that's a bunch of crap. They don't confess because they're not sorry, because the night before they were busted, they were uploading and downloading stuff. Yeah. Okay. So by the time a guy is busted, mixed in with all those films and pictures, there's going to be bestiality porn.
Yeah.
Okay. Which means prior to accessing child porn, a guy got into bestiality porn. hence the idea of furries and pup play. So people need to understand there's a progression. So by the time a guy is accessing child rape porn, he's descended through the different categories of pornography.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time child porn is found on him, he's already gone through the bestiality. He's already gone through the kink and BDSM and watching women be raped and having the hell beat out of them. That's why they develop a deep malevolence, so that the pedophiles will march on Kelly J. Keene, right?
Mm-hmm.
And say, kill TERFs, because they know that women will still protect children.
Mm-hmm.
And the last category downward is snuff porn, because then it's the silence of the lambs and you bury the bodies. Mm-hmm. So these guys that we're listening to the world's greatest liars and the most sophisticated of criminal minds. Why are we going to believe a thing that's coming out of their mouth?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard for me to, and I think for anybody who hasn't worked intensely like this, to understand that progression, or understand that somebody could go that far, or that a deviance could go that far. And that kind of brings me to a question. It's something that I believed when we're talking about like safeguarding women's spaces. People will say, well, if a predatory man is not going to take hormones, a predatory man is not going to take surgery or have a surgery just so that he could access women's spaces. So if a trans woman is taking estrogen, has maybe had a surgery, that person is genuine. They're not a threat. And I kind of believed that too, because I was like, well, they're still men, but maybe they're not scary. Maybe they don't have bad intentions. And what do you say?
What I would say is this. So if we were role playing,
Mm-hmm.
as you were saying what you would say, I would say this. And you've worked with them for how long?
Mm-hmm.
You seem pretty confident. Confident. Well, they're safe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, tell me your background. Mm-hmm. Well, I just know they're safe. Okay, tell me your clinical background. But I know they're safe. Okay. You know, when I go to the zoo, mm-hmm. there's usually a distance. There's a fence and then a moat when it comes to the polar bears.
Right.
Or when it comes to, right? But I've seen films. I've seen an old film, Born Free, and I've seen guys that go and hug lions. And, so I think because of what I've seen, and I believe I can harmonize with the animals. And so just like that one woman, a lot of people have seen the film, she saw enough Budweiser commercials prior to Dylan, where you had these nice, fluffy polar bears, and they seemed so fun. Mm-hmm. She wanted to go join them. It's a true story. I forget which zoo, but you can Google it. Woman being rescued from the polar bears. She barely got out with her life. Mm-hmm. Now, what goes on inside of the mind of someone to hop the enclosure and jump? She jumped into the moat, into the swimming area of the polar bear. It's pretty stunning. Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think the polar bears did?
Went after her.
Okay. They were going to eat her alive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's someone that in her mind, in her own private logic, based upon the input, however many videos or whatever her worldview was, she really believed. And she could tell you. So if we could talk to her, let's say we're standing next to her, and let's say she said, I think they're nice. You say, oh, I think they're fluffy. Oh, yeah, they look kind of fluffy. I think I want to go join them. You what? No, I just want to go hug them. Why do you want to do that? Because I've seen movies and I just think, look, they're so cute, and had the mama with the kid. I'm going to climb in. You're what? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I just know. Okay, so belief, but maybe I could call the zoo trainer over and say, hey, Mr. Zoo worker, she's thinking about climbing over. What would you say? Now, why am I going to, we have two people she can talk to. One is the guy eating Cracker Jacks next to us, or the guy that apparently works there and, is a biologist and worked with the polar bears. Mm-hmm. Now, Who should we let her talk to give her input as to whether or not that's a good idea to harmonize with the polar bears? Well, we could take a poll among the crowd, or we could get somebody that knows about polar bears and to give her input, because she's pretty persuaded. She has her opinion. She has her own feelings about what it would be like to get close to these polar bears. But then there's a biologist that could say, I don't know where you got your information from, but let me tell you about a polar bear. And if you hop in that water, you're not going to come out.
Yeah.
I think you're bigoted and biased and hateful. I just think you're filling my mind. I just don't believe you. Okay. And then he might say this: you ever worked around polar bears? No. You ever been to the Arctic? No. You ever gotten up close to one and put your hand near it? You ever see it eat meat? No, but I've seen commercials. Okay. So I simply ask this: anybody that believes that these guys are telling you the truth, that mean what they say, and are not playing you for fools, and don't want to access women, and weren't accessing heinous rape material, and wouldn't use an object to shove up inside a woman, then you don't know, do you? Now, I can tell you the kind of guy would, and here's an interesting phenomenon, and I recently came up with this phrase. So the general public, in a strange sort of way, believes that sexual perpetrators have morals and ethics. People say, wait, no, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, I know. Most people say, well, no. If you're going to perpetrate, if you've been looking at stuff online, you don't have morals and ethics. Okay. But don't you believe that there's a certain line beyond which no self-respecting sexual predator would take hormones or put on women's underwear? Like, come on, you're not going to do that, because that would be unethical.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you don't know.
Yeah.
A sexual predator, because they've morphed into a psychopath. Here's one thing about a psychopath people need to understand. They are driven. They just don't enjoy it, but this is entertainment for them. But they are driven to play good people for fools. So they will look you in the eye. Think about a psychopath. No conscience, therefore no empathy or remorse. Where do we find them? We find them on Wall Street. Would anybody ever lie to you that runs a hedge fund to tell you to give them your life savings and they'll invest it for you? How about a politician? Would they ever lie to you? Well, of course they'll. I don't trust them further than I can throw them. You mean you wouldn't trust a politician? Hell no. But you'll trust a guy in women's underwear that dresses in women's underwear, and you're going to open the door for them and be around your kids? Really? Who's giving you more evidence that they're more sexually deviant? Everybody makes jokes about Joe Biden sniffing women's and kids' hair. I think there's very real concern there. But they'll make more jokes about that than some guy that'll dress in women's underwear and drag and wants to read about kids. Let's pretend a guy was deviant. And let's pretend he dressed in women's underwear. And let's pretend he then put on a tutu, or he put on a leotard, or he put on a woman's swimsuit. What else would you need to know? Matter of fact, what could he show you? And why would he show you? All he's looking for is you to open the door. Do you really think he's going to tell you what he has in mind? Because he would be in prison. So he's working you. So if you're a mother, and you take your child to a guy that's dressing in women's underwear and drag, you're his best friend. He's playing you for a fool. That's why he's smiling at you. So you think he's smiling because he's friendly. It's a little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah.
We don't want to believe that somebody who's evil could smile. Well, what do you think? And could tell us a lie. What do you think propaganda is? Every cult leader, look at NXIVM.
Mm-hmm.
Keith Raniere and Allison Mack. Turns out that NXIVM was a sex cult. Guy had his own harem. You can look it up. There's a video, a documentary made called Escaping NXIVM.
Mm-hmm.
It was billed to the rich and famous and powerful. It took a lot of money as self-improvement. So you had very intelligent people ultimately being suckered in by Keith Raniere, who had done multi-level marketing before. And these women became so convinced, and Allison Mack and a couple of others would keep their eye out for those that were more and more enamored with Keith Raniere, who billed himself as the most intelligent person on earth. Who was friends with the Dalai Lama, by the way, the Dalai that asked that kid to suck his tongue.
Yeah.
Watch how many people are defending Dalai.
I know.
Okay. But I analyzed that. It's on my YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's clear that Dalai's perping on a kid.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear.
Yeah. And I think a lot, I know for me, like, you don't want to assume the worst about somebody.
But when it's right in front of your face, if it comes to child safety,
I don't know. And I guess it's
right.
Yeah. But I guess it's like, you don't want to assume. You're like, oh, it's just,
right. And so that's right. But so this is the same.
Makeup,
that's right. It's the same dynamic. It's the exact same dynamic. So let's say this: if it weren't Dolly and if it were any other guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I 100% agree with you. It's right? It's so.
So how is it that this guy? Well, he has a title. Well, the Pope has a title. Priests have a title. Teachers have titles. Boy Scouts have titles. Do you know how many victims? 85,000 victims for the Boy Scouts. 85,000. Do you know how many victims are when all is said and done about the trans movement? How about the Catholic Church? Mm-hmm. It's not just a Catholic Church. Predators will go wherever they can have access to the greatest pool of vulnerable kids. And what do they need to access kids? Believing adults. Believing what? That these are adults that want to believe the best in people, so they will give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm not saying we should get jaded. I'm saying we should have discernment, and that's what every predator is going to go after, which is intuition. Mm-hmm. If you are disengaged from your intuition, you have no discernment, then after I finish telling you, well, I know what it looks like, but it's really not that, you will actually pick up where I leave off when somebody from the outside says to you, you know, Rachel, that Uhler guy, he seems a little, or with anybody, right? Mm-hmm. I know as a perpetrator, I'm not a perpetrator, right? But let's say we're talking about pastor so-and-so or teacher so-and-so, coach so-and-so, or Dr. Larry Nasser, or whoever, right? So let's say, or drama teacher, or somebody, right? Where you're a parent and you're thinking, this guy, there's something up with that. And you maybe even ask him, you know, I think you're spending a little too much time around my kid. Say, no, it's not what it looks like. I'm just here because I care about your child and I want to invest. I want them to be their best and all that. Well, you seem to be kind of isolating my kid and spending a lot of time around him without any other adults. No. I know what it looks like, but it's really not that. Okay, what am I doing if I'm that perpetrator? I'm causing you to doubt yourself. So now it's like, well, no, I thought I would correct. So I'm causing you to dispense with your intuition. You're turning the volume down on your intuition. I know when I have you as a parent, therefore I have complete access to your kid. When somebody else comes up to you, because now you've lowered your defenses, you lowered your concern. You're now no longer concerned. I know I have you 100% when you will defend me. So somebody else comes up to you and says, hey, you know, Rachel, that drama teacher is spending a lot of time around your daughter. And you turn to that neighbor, the family member saying, well, I know what it looks like, but it's really not that. He's just investing that there.
Yeah.
Now the perpetrator has groomed you as the gatekeeper and there's nothing to stop him. And now you're going to defend him. That's how cult leaders work.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, I've always been pretty trusting of people. I believe what they say. But I'm trying to now, it's like I have little kids now, and I'm trying now to follow that instinct and that intuition. And I used to be concerned, like, oh, I don't want to come off as rude, or I don't want to come off as, I don't want to seem accusatory or make that guy feel bad when maybe his intentions are good. But now I'm just kind of at a place where I'm like, you know what? I don't care if I hurt his feelings or if I seem rude. Like, I'm going to
I don't
follow
care.
what
I
you
don't care
say.
about a guy's feelings whatsoever. And people need to
Yeah,
understand
I
this.
don't care. Like, you know
right.
what? If
That's right.
like,
That's right.
if he's good, then he should understand.
Okay.
But
And
like,
as a matter of fact, hopefully this will be helpful. Ready, Rachel? I want people I want to embolden parents. I want to embolden people to understand this, that predators automatically know. Okay. That we're talking in this day and age. You have to be brain dead. And don't think I haven't heard everything under the sun and still do on a weekly basis from these guys. Every justification, rationalization, because they don't want to admit that they were just perping on a kid, right? Because it means they're a perp. Okay, so we're going to hear everything under the sun. But in this day and age, who doesn't know that they should be careful around kids? So feel 100% encouraged and empowered to look at a guy and say this. And depends upon who it is, but at the very least say, hey, so we'll have a couple different scenarios. One is, let's say, a coach, a soccer coach. And soccer coach seems to be kind of spending a little extra attention on my kid. Okay, I need to be mindful. I need to look at it. If I see it more than once or twice, I need to go talk to the coach. And I need to say, hey, appreciate your interest in my kid. I'm just kind of curious. Okay, I'm letting that coach know that I know, and I'm just kind of curious because there's something a little above and beyond. Okay.
Yeah.
Certainly no adult should be alone with my child. And every adult knows that in this day and age. Now that's under the guise of quote unquote normal stuff. But now if a guy is focused on the sex and sexuality of kids, now it's a different ballgame. Now it's ratcheted up. So you need to feel empowered to walk up to any guy, especially if he's trying to access the private spaces of women and children, meaning where they're going to undress and where they're going to have access with their camera cell phone. You need to know that they already know they shouldn't be in there.
Yeah.
And you have every right to say, you shouldn't be in here. You know that this is not appropriate. And I would say this guy, and you and I both know you access porn behind the scenes, don't you? That's the dirty little secret that they don't want anybody to catch on to because they're saturating their minds in porn. That's why they want to access the space. And the question is, would any of these guys be willing to take hormones? This came across in a very pronounced way in one of the groups one time when the state of Pennsylvania, somebody had floated in the legislature the possibility of chemical castration, which is Lupron, by the way, which is the puberty blocker. Okay. That if a pedophile was willing to be subjected to or volunteer, one and the same, to be chemically castrated, would he be willing to do that? And therefore, he would be eligible for parole earlier. Do you know how many pedophiles said yes? Almost 100%.
Yeah.
Especially with little kids. And I'm looking, I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And I even said that. And they said, it was a no-brainer to them. I said, why? And they said, well, it's no big deal to us. Okay, there. The average person, same thing for me prior to working with these guys, we would have assumed, and this is what the assumption is for the vast majority of sex offender research, that offending is the result of hormones and lust. It's not. Deviance has nothing to do with hormones. That's why, sadly, the Static 99, the most widely utilized risk assessment tool for assessing risk, the premise is that the older someone gets, because their hormone levels drop off, they're less of a risk. So grandpa, the older guys are less of risk. That is not true. Why? Because deviance doesn't have anything to do with hormones. It has to do with a mindset where I want to traumatize and scar and mar the soul. So that's why they will also use objects.
Mm-hmm.
So people need to understand that, yes, a sex offender would more than easily take hormones.
Yeah.
And then these guys also start them and stop them in prison anyways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's really interesting to me because, I've known guys like in hospitals who are taking Lupron, and I guess I just always thought that, like, if again, I'm going to be a little graphic, like if your penis isn't working, then that kind of takes the drive away, the fun out of it or whatever. Like you're not going
There you go.
you're not going to be predatory because that sex
because
drive
we assume it's about fun. It's not about fun.
or it's about like a sex drive. But then, there's plenty of people who have really high sex drives and they're not out assaulting all the
That's
time.
right. Again, deviance is not about sex drive.
Yeah.
It's about I'm driven to have an effect. That's the difference. It's having an effect and not a good effect. I want to see in your face. I want to see trauma. I want to know in my mind that you're going to spend the rest of your life getting over me because I got over on you.
Yeah. And that's just why, just 100% female, like, again, where I'm kind of coming from, just female only spaces.
100%. Correct.
It doesn't matter what surgery you've had, what hormones.
And every guy knows it. Every guy knows it.
Yeah. Like there's just no exceptions. And
here's the reality, by the way, for restrooms. The reality is this. If you have a guy in drag that walks into a men's room, okay, this is the reality. Mm-hmm. Guy in drag comes in a men's restroom. I'll tell you exactly what'll happen. I've been around for a while. we'd look at him like, if you really think it's a woman, we'll get uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But if it's like, okay, a guy in drag, he's going to go in, he's going to do his business, and he's going to leave. Right? We might look at him like, whatever.
Yeah. Well, okay. That's the funny thing because I hear so often, like, I'm not safe in the men's room. Like, I'll get assaulted. And I'm like,
I've never once heard of a guy, unless he starts running his mouth, starts making comments and making the guys feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Okay. It is done are the days where I'm willing to give at the very least, narcissistic, attention-seeking, little emotionally immature men that need to grow up. Pardon the pun, grow a pair. They need to grow up and stop.
Don't cut your hair off,
right? But the reality is this: life is no longer about you, little Mr. Dillon, right? Or these other deviant Marsh guy. These guys are patently narcissistic, even prior to getting into porn. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, you notice how many of them take their cell phone cameras in with them. Mm-hmm. And if you go on, do a simple Google search, photographs in restrooms. And the question is this: of the biological males or females that make it into the opposite sex restrooms, how many women do you see that are dressed as guys now? Mm-hmm. How many photographs out there posted online do you see of the women that are passing as men take photographs and put them online? I've never seen one.
Yeah.
Why do guys take pictures of themselves dressed as women in women's underwear and women's restrooms? I'll tell you exactly why. Because they're sending the message to the world and other perpetrators that they've made it. They've crossed the boundaries. They are preening. And it's a very dangerous thing because most people have seen different videos now that were put online of these guys dressed in drag and women's underwear that are masturbating in the women's room, washroom, with women right in there. These are predatory men. The same thing, that a man that dresses in women's underwear, I ask people this: where do you think he got his underwear? Yeah. And they stop for a second, right? Yeah. He stole them. Any guy that's starting to wear women's underwear, he's stealing them, is a very dangerous individual. Mm-hmm. How can I say that? Because I've done sex offender treatment for 14 years. Mm-hmm. People need to understand, by the time a guy is wearing women's underwear, he's extremely deviant, and he's watched porn, typically on the dark web, where women are being gang raped, women are being murdered, body parts are being chopped up. He's watching bestiality. He's watching child porn. Mm-hmm. That's who's entering the private spaces. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter how nice he looks.
Yeah.
You don't know what he's accessing behind closed doors once he gets home, do you? Right? To the average person that wants to push his stuff. Can you follow him 24/7? Can you tell me what he's doing behind closed doors? No. He's smiling. He's laughing all the way to the bank. He goes home and he watches the most vile porn where women are being raped and children are being raped. And he's played you for a fool. He's putting women and children in harm's way. And how do you not know that he's testing the resolve and the discernment of the other adults? And before you know it, in these schools, we think these are pride flags. These are calling cards for predators.
Yeah, and this might seem kind of like a silly question, but like with cross-dressing, there was I shared something on Twitter a few weeks ago about this man wearing a pencil skirt and like a woman's blouse and high heels. And he's like, I just love wearing dresses and heels. Like, can you assume he's probably wearing women's underwear that he stole? Like, he's not wearing men's underwear. Like, would you assume that?
That's right. What I would say this.
Yeah.
Does anybody does anybody believe that he's wearing men's underwear? Well, isn't that a little self-defeating if he wants to feel like a woman? Of course he's going to wear women's underwear. He's wearing women's underwear first, and then he puts on these dress. And so the question I then follow up with is this, and you believe him? And then I ask this other question. Do you believe he's ever accessed pornography?
Probably. But then they'll say like, oh, well, all guys have it.
Right. And then I'm going to say this. How much pornography do you think he's accessed and how many years? And what kind? Do you think it's progressed? What kind do you think he was accessing last night?
Yeah.
Why do you think he's dressed like that? Do you think maybe he's accessing that? Do you think he might be accessing harder stuff? Do you think he might be playing you for a fool?
Yeah.
And then I ask this, and how many years have you worked with men that are perked on people? All they need is for people to be naive and to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
The psychopathic mind loves playing good people for fool because that's half the fun of the sport of it. They get off on that as well. That's why they'll sit there and they'll tell people, they're just seeing how naive people are. What you really see in sex offender treatment is finally once you confront these guys and they know that you're not buying it anymore, then you can finally start to get some honesty out of them. It's very interesting because they don't believe you know. But once they finally figured out that they're full of crap and everything they're saying, they're lying through the teeth, the little veneer comes down and it's like, okay, well, I'll tell you. Now it comes. Out comes the truth. How heinous they are.
Yeah. I'm kind of speechless hearing some of these things, but I'm grateful to hear it. And I think more people need to hear it so that when they hear somebody saying, oh, they just want to, these people, they just want to play on sports because sports are so important to them.
That's right.
They feel safer in women's spaces. This is just medical care and we need this for like and my response is, can you make it? That's right. Can they make it any easier for sexual predator? Yeah. And again, like you mentioned earlier, some people really are victims of this. Like some people who go into it, I definitely believe that there are victims that fall into these lies, like, oh, maybe I'm in the wrong body, or whatever. But the people pushing it, they know better and they're lying. And so, okay, I'm aware of the time, so I want to let you go in a minute. Thank you so much for your information and for talking to me today. Can you just for a minute or two share some of your resources for parents, for caregivers, for whoever, your Christian or church support? You name them because I can't remember them.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I've got a couple different websites. The first one was and still is my training site for churches. That's my number one concern. Again, we're talking about guys in drag. My number one concern are churches, to be honest, because again, predators will dress however they need to dress or feel is in their best interest. So a predator will just as easily put on women's underwear as a clergy collar. People need to understand that. Yeah. So it just depends upon which works for them more. And now they're combining it. Now we see that some churches are inviting these guys. So it's the best of all worlds. And that's why a lot of these churches, quite frankly, are serving as cover for child trafficking. Because if you can get a young person into prostitution, now you can be their pimp. You're going to work it. You're working them. And I'm seeing more and more that there are these churches that are connected to people that then get into schools that are reading specialists, and they're helping kids, and they coordinate their efforts. I'm working with somebody that is looking into a school system in a Midwest state, and it's becoming pretty clear to me that I think they have a child trafficking network that they've coordinated between a church, school system, people that are embedded within the educational system, and even some Department of Children and Family Services. That's how some of these people work. There's a situation like that in Ohio. Somebody got on the city council and the head of Children and Family Services, and then two guys. One was her husband, who was a pastor, and then a youth pastor, and they were trafficking teens. So it's really dangerous. So churchprotect.org. As a matter of fact, it has some of the background of my research is on there. So churchprotect.org would be the first. The next site is my primary site, that is SurvivorSupport.net. So two separate words scrunched together, no underscore space. So SurvivorSupport.net. There are two tabs under the Insights tab. If you drop down, you'll see the trans deception and what is the trans movement afraid of. Spend some time on there. I recommend for anybody. There's a ton of information. It's really a repository. It's sort of a one-stop shop, sort of. Then I have a blog called, and you also can learn about predators, certainly on churchprotect.org, on SurvivorSupport.net. I have a lot of, under the Insights tabs, a lot of sub-tabs on predators. SurvivorSupport.us is my blog that primarily focuses on predators, but the first one, the most frequently accessed post, deals with how is it that professionals, or what are the red flag indicators of abuse? What are those? How are professionals overlooking those? Some title, something like that. Then I would recommend the site, Unmasking the Trans Movement. And that is there to speak to this issue in a lot of different ways. So I would say parents and all good people need to be mindful that there are people that are vying for our kids. And they unfortunately have found a very convenient way to gain access to very vulnerable kids. And it's a very damaging, potentially deadly and lethal. They ain't playing games. And so they, meaning some very dark special interests. And we don't want to believe that people would use kids. But that's our issue, because we somehow believe that human nature has changed over the millennia. And the human nature is still the same. And so all predators need is for us to believe that there aren't predators. And that's when we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. So there are financial predators that actually make their way into medicine. We would never believe, and we're all shocked. We would never believe that a doctor would order surgery on somebody. Just think about a regular doctor. Would a regular doctor recommend an appendicitis when one isn't necessary? Well, every now and then you uncover. We have all heard of stories like this, that doctors are ordering unnecessary surgeries. Well, the patient, we're sort of at a deficit. We don't know. Right? And the doctor said,
13-year-old girls.
Okay. And right. And so now, would they ever consider the profit margin? Well, we also know that in the field of medicine and in hospitals, they consider the profit margin on the opposite end, how to cut costs. And so they withhold, we call them utilization review boards. So both cost savings, so to speak, and profit center. Well, this is an entire industry now. And so, yes, there are doctors that are more than happy to fast track kids to have their breast sliced off or genitals removed. And we say, well, it can't be, and that's all they need. So
He went
Dr.
to Harvard
Gallagher,
Medical School. He went to
all
Yale.
of them,
Yep. Mhm.
right? And so I'm more than happy to talk to any of these doctors, right? But we have a number of good interviews by a number of good, safe, and reasonable doctors on unmasking the trans movement. Dr. Patella, Dr. Van Mall will give medical perspective. Jenny King, an RN, does a nice job looking at the affirmation model and the dangers of all that, what happens when a kid goes on the hormones. And then Dr. Diana Kenny out of Australia has done a video with us. So there's a lot of good information. But for parents, you need to understand the dangers of the trans movement. It's a moving sidewalk. If a kid gets on there, it's heading toward, it'll go through the stage of eventual, once kids get on, once you medicalize these kids, your kids will 100% be sterilized.
Mhm.
Let that sink in. It's sterilization, and then it will dump a child, this moving sidewalk, out onto a surgeon's gurney where they will have their sex organs amputated. And they will be a consumer of Big Pharma for life. That's the trans movement. And along the way, they're easy prey for sexual predators. So no man thinks it's a reasonable proposition to go into the private spaces of women and children unless he wants access. And you notice they always take their cell phone camera, their video camera in with them.
Mhm. Well, I think that's a good place to end here. So thank you again, Jon, and to anybody who's listening. I'm going to stop the recording right here and hope you'll have a fabulous day.